Hello, and welcome to episode 209 of Prose. This week, hear a war story. While you listen, please consider heading to prosepodcast.com, our one-stop shop for all things prose. There you can find links to social media, the episodes, the shop for swag, the show's Patreon, and more. On social media, like and share away. Comment on the stories. Let me know what you think. Most importantly, please do consider subscribing, rating, and or reviewing wherever you grab your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Let's get to the tales, shall we? This week, we have Them. Enjoy.
Them, an original short story by Jared I. McGee. My grandpa never really talked about the war. I didn't get the sense that he wanted to. Not at all. Even as an ever-inquisitive child, I knew better than to delve too deeply in that period of Grandpa's past. Sure, when we were watching a new film that touched on the war, he'd give an approving, well, at least they got that right, or shout some form of condemnation. Oh, come on! That's just utter fiction. But that was about it. When I grew up a bit and began thinking of using my educational funding to go to officer training school, he was quick to speak up, though. From the time I was 15 until he passed away the summer of my 25th year, his commentary about all things armed forces was the same refrain. I fought in the war so you could have a better life. Please do not throw all that away and go right back into that life. Please. I must admit, by the time I hit about 16, not knowing all that much about the war from a primary source was infuriating me. I've always loved to learn. The holo cards we had to watch at school about the war were, well, let's just say that, even at 6 years old, I recognized them for what they truly were. Thinly veiled propaganda produced to ensure that we never lost sight of why we did what we did to them. Still, war seems to always appeal to young boys, and my fanciful imagination was easily ensnared by flashing bombs, vast ship battles just outside of orbit, and the over-the-top narration that the war correspondents peppered in with all that exciting imagery. So yes, a great deal of my desire to speak with my grandpa about the war was academic, but that wasn't the entirety of it, of course. I knew then, and I know now, that I'm being honest when I say that I was desperate to be proud of my grandfather and what I was just certain were his grandiose achievements. This personal connection to an event that changed the course of our planet seemed irresistible to me. From the research I did independently of Grandpa, including off-the-cuff conversations I had with my grandmother, my father, and my uncle, I learned that he first enlisted in the Army, eager to serve the great cause against them. This was true of almost everyone in Turin, Mississippi. Hell, it was true of almost any poor kid in all the southern portion of the North American Alliance. He was almost fully through boot camp when they realized that he was 1 year too young to enlist, even with the newly passed ordinance lowering the age of enlistment to 17. As desperate as the Earth Forces were for recruits, Granddad got pulled from his upcoming graduation and subsequent first mission, set to wait it out until he was officially 17 years old as per his birth certificate and governmental records. Grandpa did mention this from time to time there at the end, when he was too exhausted to filter what was coming out of his mouth. He'd essentially be thanking God for allowing him to miss that first mission and have his family and his life. As it turned out, his regiment was wiped out to a man as they tried to charge an enemy position outside the Poseidon lunar installation. Most everyone now knew that those regiments were essentially fodder. The kids from rich families and with educations were held back for some time yet. A meticulous clerical worker saved his life. Oh, the oddities of life. My dogged pursuit of his involvement kept that narrative open for me to move forward with Grandpa's story, thanks, in large part, to the fastidious service records that the newly confederated Earth forces kept. After he turned 17, he went through one more round of psych testing, and then he was off in the wake of his now dead comrades, cousins, and campmates, landing on the moon 1 full year to the day after their slaughter. Through some pretty nasty ground battles, Grandpa's company was among the forces that took back Poseidon from them. I'm pretty sure he earned a medal or a special patch or something, but he never wore it, and I never saw it. Well, not while he was alive anyway. This particular unit of his went on to fight its way all around the lunarscape, freeing this base and that, defending this colony pod or that. Grandpa's time was up rather quickly, though, in the grand scheme of the war. So he was shipped back home to the swamplands of the Mississippi Delta, and the others, whose service was not yet up, kept on fighting. This had to have bothered Grandpa because he was home for all of 3 months when he signed up to fight again. This time, he joined the Terrestrial Air Force. He must have been one fast learner. He was doing navigation for a terrestrial pilot for a domestic defense a mere 60 days after re-enlisting, and those missions must have been a resounding success because the service records on file say that he was specially picked, along with his assigned pilot, Jim Hackney, to begin orbital defense maneuvers. Quite the unprecedented promotion, even in the trying times they were in. And those missions must have also been something utterly fantastic too. Roughly 3 months after the promotion to ODM, Hackney and Grandad headed off to what were the front lines, the far side of Mars. Again, in the archived records, I saw commendation after commendation. Where Granddaddy stored all those patches, those medals, those fancy pieces of embossed paper signed by the Joint Command, I could not have guessed. The younger me was ecstatic, squealing approval and excitement from all those years ago. Weekend after weekend, I scanned countless holocards and database files and even a handful of old written records kept around at our libraries to give them a sense of solemnity. Weekend after weekend, I found in those holocards files and yellowed pages mounting evidence that my grandfather was the hero I'd always known him to be. A boy's fancies are one thing, though. Reading the avalanche of accounts that dignified my imaginings into tactility was overwhelming to me. More than once, I wiped tears from my eyes. At first, I'd have said those were tears born of pride for my grandpa. Now, I think they were a mix of a very real happiness to know him better and a form of mourning the horrors he must have endured. The war was a horrific thing. All wars were. They always have been. But the war? How my grandfather and his friends must have suffered. The atrocities they witnessed. The atrocities they committed. The weaponry used at the end of the war was some nasty stuff. Weapons generally are, of course, but these were unprecedentedly nasty. They went beyond nukes or hydrogen bombs or ion defibs or any of that mess. These shredded the very atoms apart in a living thing, I honestly still don't know how they work, despite watching more specials on the Holocaust at home for just about all of my life. The science behind it fascinated me at an early age. Morbid? Maybe. But youngster me couldn't fathom the darkness that surrounded those terrible munitions. My grandfather never saw the drop on them. He was not part of the strike team that was set to hit the major installations on Mars. They called the squads that dropped the munitions the exterminators, because that is what they were doing. Exterminating an entire race. Species? Whatever. All I know is that they all but ended that day. It was a perfect solution for the military, to be sure. 80% of them were painfully shredded into oblivion, and the terraforming that had been so costly to the major corporations and the unified governments of Earth stayed intact. An old wives' tale about the fallout changing the color of the sky for some reason or another has been bandied about since that day, but I've never heard if there's any truth to it or not, and I've never been to Mars. Granddad didn't see the drop, but he did end up as part of the cleanup crew, as they were lovingly labeled by the popular media on Earth. They went from installation to installation, eradicating the remaining vestiges of them. This mission is the one that affected Grandpa the most. I know this because he told me. The one time he ever told me what most would call a war story. After Grandma passed, Grandpa's decline wasn't sharp. It was slow, but steady, and he knew that going to a home was inevitable, just for his own safety and comfort. He said as much. Toward the end of his time at the old house there in Terrene, he and I sat down and watched some old holocausts of shows that had been all but ancient when he was a boy. Those programs were old sitcoms before they fell out of fashion and were laughed at, not for the embedded comedy, but for the antiquated absurdity they gave off. His favorite of them followed the exploits of Thelma Harper, an old lady with a mean sense of humor and a persnickety means of treating her family and friends. Each episode had some sort of inherent quasi-moral message, but I thought some of her revelations were less than enlightening. Still, I cherished watching the old casts that had been converted from even older media. They made him smile. They made him laugh. And that was life to me. After a very long session of laughing and explanations on why the program wasn't truly realistic based on his life experiences, my grandfather turned to me and said he wanted to tell me something about the war. The episode we just watched was on divorce, something at that point that was foreign to my family, not war. I must admit that I was taken aback, but shock gave way to eagerness rather quickly. I muted the caster and leaned in, so that Grandpa knew full well that he had my full attention. What followed was singular. Even as he was only just beginning his tale, his entire demeanor changed. Tone of voice, facial expression, body language. It was as if he'd morphed into someone else entirely. With his eyes so wide that I thought that they would tear, he proceeded to tell me the story I'd longed for. He and his battalion landed near the Northeast Quadrant HQ, which was, for all intents and purposes, what served as a capital for them. Everything was desolation. Death stank to the point where many of the troops wore filters, despite the air having been long devoid of any lingering bit of the weapon, and having even longer since been made breathable for humans. Grandpa and his comrades in arms tromped and stomped ever forward in apoplectic fury, ready to take on any of them that came across their fearful path, defiant in the face of the most fearsome weapon ever deployed in the history of the human race. He and his company were actually a bit bored in the first couple weeks of the mission. Others had cleared them out at this point, so this was more guard duty and other more menial tasks. Grandpa was okay with this, despite having served for so very long on the shifting front lines. He had never gained a taste for war. One day, amid the tedium though, he found himself walking among the hollowed-out skeletons of buildings blown away in the drive to obliterate them. He was walking his assigned sector, and he came to realize he was being shadowed from behind the rubble. He began whistling a tune, as if to say to whoever was following him, "Hey, I'm not afraid of you." His words, by the way, not mine. He diverted his course to loop closer to where another soldier would intersect with his route sooner than later, but within about 5 minutes the shadows no longer kept them from him. He stopped stark still as two of them came toward him. One male, one female, the female being the smaller of them. The sounds made by them were fluid but utterly foreign to his ears. Unlike their ships and this fluid yet halting tongue, they didn't look all that unlike a human. Bipedal, their skin was a bit pale, maybe a tinge yellow, as if the moon were come to life. Huge, dark, almond-shaped eyes sat in the same place they would on a human too. For all the hatred and fear the human race afforded them, the two races just weren't really all that different. Both initially approached Grandpa, but he fired into the air. The male looked back at the female, chirped something that felt like orders to Grandpa, and the female slunk off into the darkness. The male, however, kept approaching. Grandpa went to fire near the feet of it, but his rifle seemed frozen somehow. To the day he told me the tale, he never did figure out why his trusty firearm wouldn't send its deadly pulse out again. Because he was on this supposedly menial duty, Grandpa wasn't assigned sidearm or any light charges. Had he been anyone but Grandpa, he'd have been unarmed. But Grandpa was a Mississippi farm boy, and ever the lover of history. And he carried an ancient piece of gear that the military still allowed its people to carry, but did not force upon them, and hadn't for ages. It's known as a bayonet. It's a crude thing, a slim blade meant to be attached to the end of a firearm and used as a stabbing and slashing mechanism. So as that thing approached him, Granddaddy went to fix his bayonet to his weapon. But in less than a blink, it was on him, tackling him to the ground with a major pop and a crunch to his back. Granddad had the bayonet in his hand, but he was being held by the crushing power of this odd being that looked too close to humanly for him, this close. Grandpa said it seemed like hours, but it probably lasted but seconds. He slowly pressed past the strength so common of them, and slid the bayonet into its chest. It wailed. It fell back. It started backing away, scuttling backward on the ground, what would be its butt on the ground and its limbs propelling it backward, scuttle, scuttle, scuttle. Grandpa ran and leapt back on it, forcing the bayonet past that crushing grip again. And again. And again. Rather quickly, it was dead. He heard a higher-pitched wailing this time, in the distance, as a fellow soldier that he'd been hoping to encounter finally came up to him. Granddad sank down knowing this man had his back, and that he could let his guard down marginally. The soldier said, "Damn, you gut that silkworm like he was a fish." Grandpa cringed at that epithet and wiped his bayonet and his hands clean, staring an unbroken stare into the rubble a short distance away, wondering if he'd just murdered this thing, this woman's husband, her lover, the father of her children. The only other detail he remembered and related to me before zoning back into the present moment was that he vomited and continued to retch long after his stomach was empty. This was the one time he told me a story from the war. Never before or after did he touch on anything remotely like this. It was only another 9 months before he had to move to the home, and another 3 years before he passed. I sent him hollows every day, and I even wrote him actual physical letters twice a week too. He always loved all things antiquarian, and letter writing was something we two shared for as long as I'd been alive. When I received the news, I almost fell over. I've seen many a cast where some dramatic program or another shows a person doing that after they'd received bad news, but I always thought it was nothing but over-dramatization for effect. Nope. My knees buckled, my head swam. I sat down hard on the nearest bench at the university where I was teaching. History, of course. Keeping my breakfast down was a small miracle in that moment. My God, did I ever love him? I bawled at the funeral for having lost him, yes, but also for the death of a way of life. His love of anachronism and holding fast to all things archaic had been something most have not encountered in 1,000 years. And, more than likely, no one will see it slack again in this world. What really sent me off an emotional cliff was watching the age-old tradition fold out where current members of the joint military come and pay their respects. They saluted his body. They folded up both a North American flag and a battle flag made from all the various companies he was a part of. They played some music on some ancient brass instrument. They fired off pulses into the air, a fitting farewell to Granddaddy, this ancient and esteemed practice of a major demonstration of being unarmed and therefore utterly in the power and at the mercy of the honored. That honor and the respect of it all. I was just so damned proud that my grandpa had this send-off. Now, years and years later, hindsight has reframed a great deal of the war for us. As everyone knows, the purpose of coming to Mars and Earth's moon for them was not to invade and destroy humanity. They were just fleeing a larger scourge that had invaded them and threatened to destroy them with genocide and forced work. At the time, we could not have known that. But it does make me squirm a bit now. How much of the history of the human race would be different if we slowed down and actually thought a bit, asked a question or two? Those that served in the war are all but gone now, but they are still lauded as heroes, despite the different frames of reference available these days. And shouldn't they be? Launching time and time again into the unknown against the unknown and being made to become the monsters we, comfortable terrestrials, cannot bring ourselves to become? Then again, how often has such violence and horror been unleashed at any number of them, the thousands of thems, in the history of our people? Man, I don't know. My grandpa never really talked about the war. I didn't get the sense that he wanted to. Thank you for listening to Them. The sound effects and tracks present were taken from a multitude of artists that were kind enough to upload their work at freesound.org. They are Phones, Paradactyloptrix, City Rocker, Vumsaplutin 1709, Gis_Sweden, STK13, and Cheese Puff. Please do follow the links provided in the show notes to check out more work from all of these fabulous individuals. All of the sounds are being used under CC 0 1.0 Universal Public Domain dedication licenses. Again, many sincere thanks to these creators.
That does it this week for Prose. As always, As you continue about your week, I do hope that you will love those around you, tell them that you do, and embrace this life as it is, always stranger than fiction. Thank you so much for listening.